Christmas is such a paradoxical time of year. There is the generosity paradox, the one that asks why sometimes the more expensive our gift, the less valuable it is. I remember buying my children an expensive present and they ended up having more fun with the box that it came in than the gift itself. One of my favourite paradoxes is the Chris Rea paradox. The classic song Driving Home for Christmas was actually written when he and his wife Joan were stuck in a traffic jam somewhere between London and Middlesbrough, going nowhere. It's the last song I want to play the other 364 days of the year, but whenever I'm driving one of my kids home for Christmas, I always put it on at full volume. Then there's the whole family paradox. Those we love the most can be the hardest to spend time with. Hanging out with our relatives at Christmas can be relatively tricky. Christmas can be the time when we feel most loved, but it's also the time that many of us feel most isolated. Perhaps you're trying to build your own Christmas traditions from scratch or trying to recreate memories from long ago. Perhaps you're yo-yoing between parents and in-laws or between grandchildren, nephews, nieces and elderly relatives, or managing the complex arrangements of children whose parents now live in different homes, different cities or even different countries. Perhaps you're spending your first Christmas without your spouse or child or best friend. Perhaps you're spending your first Christmas in the UK. While Christmas can be the most wonderful time of the year, it can also be the most difficult. Joseph and Mary, that first Christmas, can identify with the paradoxes of the season. The most wonderful time in their life, the birth of their firstborn son, takes place in what is also the most unsettled period of their life. Bethlehem, where the nativity takes place and which will eternally be remembered as a place of great joy and peace, turns out to be just a temporary, scary and rather hostile stopover. Let's look at these three elements of what I call the Bethlehem paradox. Number one, Bethlehem, where connection and disconnection meet. Joseph and Mary did not live in Bethlehem. They were forcibly displaced there by an edict from a dictator. The Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus required everyone in the empire to return to their ancestral home for a census. The census was conducted for taxation and administrative purposes, and Joseph, being a descendant of King David, had to go to his ancestral town of Bethlehem. There were no exceptions and no excuses. Can you imagine living in a country where you were suddenly forced to drop everything and go to the place where your great-great-grandfather was born, or be imprisoned for sedition? Bethlehem, for Mary and Joseph, represented everything that was hard about living in an occupied territory under a ruthless dictator. Add to that the complication that Mary was heavily pregnant and they can't travel quickly, and so when they arrive in Bethlehem, there is nowhere left for them to stay. They have to make use of a stable as an antenatal unit. If they'd been rich, perhaps they could have bought their way into something better. But Jesus' first home is in squalid temporary accommodation. Bethlehem, for Mary and Joseph, is the place where their firstborn son is born, the place where the star stopped and the angels sang. But it's also the place where they can't find housing, where they're treated like animals, and where an evil king will try to kill their baby. It's a convergence of good and evil, of love and pain, of hope and distress. It's a place where they connect with God, even when disconnected from all those they love. This year in Bethlehem, many families are thinking along similar lines. The town is no longer safe. Their homes are under threat. Should they stay and hope that the conflict in their region dies down, or should they leave and become refugees? Where would they go? Many countries around them are indicating that they have no room left for refugees. Bethlehem, now as then, epitomizes what it's like to feel displaced, far from home, anxious about the future. Perhaps you feel like you're in your own Bethlehem, in some sort of limbo between the life you once had and the life you would like to have. Wonderful and difficult things are happening around you, and you can't quite settle. I believe all of us know what it feels like to be displaced to some extent. Perhaps it's so we can have empathy with refugees around the world. Perhaps it's so we can connect with God. It's here in the middle of social, political and personal turmoil that ordinary people encountered Jesus for the first time. The second paradox is that Bethlehem is the place where hope and fear meet. From almost the beginning of time, God promised that he would fix the broken world that we live in. Centuries came and went, and still God's people held on to the hope that he would send someone to save them, a Messiah. God dropped clues throughout history that were recorded in prophecies in the Old Testament that kept people's hopes alive. One of these clues was that the promised Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. When the wise men followed the star to find the new king, they headed straight for King Herod's palace because they assumed that the capital city was the most likely place for a new king to be born. King Herod was surprised by the news, but his advisors weren't. They knew that ancient prophecy written hundreds of years before had identified Bethlehem as the place where God's chosen one would be born. The wise men left the palace and happily continued their quest, but King Herod was livid. He had no intention of giving up any of his power to this new king. He reacts just like other evil dictators react to perceived threat, with unrestrained violence. He did not care that civilian children would become collateral damage so long as his position was secured. In the midst of this terrifying period of history, God sent the long-awaited Messiah. He sent great hope when there was great fear. In Bethlehem today, there are military blockades on every route. The tourist shops that are usually packed at this time of the year are empty. People are asking themselves the same question Mary and Joseph had to ask. Should we stay in our homes and risk death, or leave and become refugees? Where can we go to find sanctuary? Whatever the difficult situations we find ourselves in, they are not so bad that God cannot bring hope. One of our favourite carols is O Little Town of Bethlehem, and it puts it like this: where meek souls will receive him still, the dear Lord enters in. The third paradox is that Bethlehem is the place where hostility and hospitality meet. Despite the hostility Mary and Joseph faced, they chose a path of incredible hospitality. They welcomed not only the Son of God into their lives, but local shepherds and migrating wise men to worship Jesus in their home. The story of Bethlehem is the story of a place that had no room, and yet someone, an anonymous innkeeper, made room anyway. It's the story of a family, poor and tired outsiders, getting used to the rhythms of life with a new baby in temporary accommodation, who go out of their way to welcome an array of surprising guests. It's the story of God inviting himself into the lives of an ordinary Middle Eastern family with roots in the small town of Bethlehem. When Jesus came to Bethlehem, it was an act of solidarity with all those who feel worthless, displaced, forgotten, or mistreated. It was an act of hope for those who face the greatest fears, and it was an act of hospitality. The baby that was born in Bethlehem, who was forcibly displaced as a refugee to Egypt and who ended up dying for the world in Jerusalem, would rise again from the dead, ultimately defeating oppression everywhere. He would sacrifice everything he had, his very life, so that he could welcome us home to God. The Bethlehem paradox shows us that hospitality, hope, and connection can be born in the most unlikely of places. It shows us that however far from home we feel from God, God is closer than we think. He knows what it's like to be displaced, vulnerable, disconnected, afraid, even a refugee child. He was born and died to fix our broken world. And even today, he invites you and me to trust him as he works out his good and perfect plan. He invites us to follow him into the mess of the world around us and bring hope there by showing compassion and hospitality to everyone who needs it.